Last time on the Secret Origins of Mint Condition
is the long-awaited episode where we are going to discuss the Star Trek, the motion picture, and whether or not it is the best Star Trek movie and thing of all time or not.
Why do I feel like all of a sudden I'm under the light in the courtroom in Star Trek 6 with surrounded by Klingons with pain sticks?
And
I don't
think
light
you
is
want to
shining
hear
down
your
on me.
complaints here, Captain. I do believe you know what you signed up for, sir.
I was into the motion picture and enjoyed watching it because it was part of the mythology of Star Trek. But as a kid, as an early teenager, I just didn't connect with it. It was like, okay, now I know what happened here. Watching the 4K version and watching it on a 4K TV and seeing some of the remastering and getting a sense sort of what was, what they wanted to communicate. Wow, it is visually stunning, thematically stunning, and really achieves that. Unfortunately, I still find the movie itself kind of boring.
I've only seen Star Trek the Motion Picture once, and that was in the context of everything that's been said on this podcast, having heard all of it. So I wasn't exactly able to go in fresh exactly.
And I didn't really watch this movie all the way through until preparation came for this episode. I watched the 4K remastered edition. I would have to say I thought it was, I didn't mind it.
Over the course of this tribunal, we will prove that Star Trek, the motion picture, is just a rehash of the episode The Changeling. We will prove unequivocally that Star Trek, the motion picture, tried to essentially be two different movies at the same time.
Star Trek Parallel Parking in Space, Star Trek the Motionless Picture, Star Trek the Emotionless Picture was the culmination of failed restarts to a franchise. Sorry, Josh, I use the F word.
I'd like to recognize and thank my opposing counsel, Captain Peluso, for some measure of restraint that fiction, I think, after Star Wars was action-adventure with sci-fi trappings. And I think Star Trek, the motion picture, resisted the lure of doing action-adventure in space, which was certainly in Star Trek's wheelhouse.
However, I feel the depth of the story, and again, we will prove, had been previously done in a previous Star Trek episode. And it is not, just in the interest of full clarity, it is not the goal of, the prosecution to argue that we could have written a better story.
Jack also mentioned that the design of the refitted Enterprise, I think, is still my favorite looking, most beautiful looking spaceship in all of science fiction. So that said, Joe, I certainly appreciate what you were saying about, the audience being brought to their feet with Superman, the movie, and with Star Wars. But I would question the presumption implicit in that the goal of every movie has to be to bring the audience to their feet.
The biggest thing for me when it comes to storytelling is pace. And that's always true. And I think that there are places to take your time. The reason for me that particular, the scene that is being referred to as parallel parking in space, the reason that didn't work for me personally, or I should say that I sort of lost interest, was that I didn't feel they had earned that moment in the film. I don't know. It felt, the movie in general feels to me a little bit like almost like the most controversial part of sci-fi.
Jack said something interesting that the movie was possibly too ambitious, which I don't even know if that's something I would disagree with. I would take a movie that is trying to be too ambitious over a movie lacking in ambition almost any day of the week. I think that Star Trek: The Motion Picture was a bold endeavor. I think it made some choices that weren't necessarily the most straightforward choices they could have made, and I think that was very courageous in the pursuit of trying to do something worthy of the name Star Trek: The Motion Picture.
Prosecution, Captain Jack and Captain Joe will have to talk about. Well, Captain Jack especially, you'll have to talk about the how it is similar to the Changeling, and I'm sure that will open up other comments for this entire trial.
And now, the conclusion.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Secret Origins of Mint Condition, and we finally made it after more than a year and some change of the first part of recording. what will be this episode. We are finally back together. Not everyone, but we are finally back in Starfleet headquarters to wrap up the motion picture episode. And joining me is their same cast. Well, almost. So first up is my other Commodore. Okay, I almost forgot. My other Commodore. Almost, it's been so long. John Whittemore is here.
Glad to be here.
Chris was going to be here with us, but as his ship was entering orbit and he was beaming in, we had a transporter malfunction, and we thought he was going to be dead, but really we just saved him in the buffer for now. So hopefully we'll get that all squared away.
He's
but
in the same buffer with Scotty.
Yeah, the same buffer with Scotty. We learned that trick from Relics. So Chris, unfortunately, is not here, but we do have our prosecution and our defendant. So introducing for the prosecution, Captain Joe Paluzzo is here.
Happy to be here.
Also, senior, I guess, lead for the prosecution, Captain Jack Adrien is joining us as well.
May it please the court.
And, of course, the episode that with who this would not be possible is our renegade captain, the defendant, Josh Bernhard is with us as well.
That away.
I need to say something before we get underway. You keep referring to him as renegade, right?
Yeah.
Are you Josh? Are you related to Garth of Izar, renegade captain? I mean,
no, I'm not. I'm not related to Garth of Izar. I am related to. My Star Trek brain is going to ruin this joke, but who was the captain who gave the planet the U.S. Constitution?
Oh yeah,
that guy.
That guy.
That guy.
I have to look it up on Memory Alpha.
He's creepier than Garth.
No, I know. I'm sorry, guys. I'm getting over COVID, so my Star Trek recall isn't as sharp as it was last time.
Well,
let's just chalk it up to COVID.
Well, I want to actually start this episode by something we probably should have done the first episode, but I didn't. Is that just to clarify, Josh, what you're defending here? Because like this original premise of this episode or this whole 2 episodes started from one of our very first episodes of the podcast, which was like episode 7, where I tasked you with just picking your 5 favorite Star Trek things of all time across all media. And you ended that episode with saying your number 1 pick was Star Trek: The Motion Picture. So I guess what I'm really asking for this, as we enter our final round of this, are you defending that the motion picture is the greatest thing Star Trek has put out, or are you merely defending that we should give it a second look and it's not as bad as we all think it might be, or is, depending on your opinion?
Somewhere in between. I am not saying that it's the greatest thing Star Trek has ever produced. I'm also not saying merely that it's not as bad as you think. I actually think it's a good to great movie that is misunderstood and underrated and deserves reappraisal.
Okay, so you're like sort of just hoping like to give it like everyone to give it a try again with a different lens after you.
Yes.
Like okay, all right. So
yes.
So that's what we're really judging here. Okay,
it's better than Star Trek 5. Come on.
It is. Well, I haven't rewatched Star Trek 5, but I'm
don't bother.
All right, so now we have that out of the way. That's what you're defending. So if audience, as we know, we do this podcast in order, so I hope you've gone back however many episodes it was and listened to the first part of this. But where we left off part 1 is that Jack, the prosecution, was going to talk about how the motion picture is just a redo of The Changeling. And Joe, you had left off with having some gripes about the acting and some of the overall producing of the movie. So Jack, I'm going to throw it to you since that's sort of where you left off. What are your thoughts about this movie being very similar or just a rehashing of The Changeling?
Thank you, James, my co-counsel, Joe, and my opposing counsel, Josh. And so I think
you're really intimidating with how well you conduct yourself as a real genuine attorney. Never mind the fact that I'm outnumbered 2-1, but continue. Thanks for the interruption.
It's in the blood. It's in the blood.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So those who are Star Trek fans and even those who aren't, I would just like to bring your attention to the episode called The Changeling. This is an episode from season 3, arguably some say the weakest season. brought back due to a letter writing campaign. And this is the second episode. Was written by John Meredith Lucas, director Mark Daniels, and it's a synopsis. The crew of the USS Enterprise deals with a life-destroying space probe originally launched from Earth. I think you can see the parallels here. And so in that episode, just to quickly give everyone a recap, the probe is kind of sent out from Earth. It was an old-styled probe. It essentially merged with a different, more intelligent alien probe, and the two programmings kind of got commingled. And so then the whole notion of the episode is really just trying to demonstrate. So the probe, when it comes back to Earth, when the Enterprise finds it, the programming has been changed not only to seek out new life, but to eradicate imperfect life. And so their Enterprise is only spared because Kirk's name is very similar to the name of the actual creator of the probe. I think it's John Royce Kirk.
Jackson Roy Kirk.
Yes,
Jackson Roy Kirk.
Jackson Roy Kirk. The whole episode kind of goes down a very popular trope in Star Trek. Kirk versus the machine, and Kirk wins. In many ways, those who have seen Star Trek the Motion Picture, it's, I think, very clear to see the connective tissue with respect to the overall plot, just to kind of bring some storytelling ideas together. Each story needs a story, needs a plot, and needs a theme. And so the plot is the actual action that's going on. And so I think the action there is very similar. The emotion, which is essentially the story, the string of information about the cast of characters, again, is very similar. It's basically humanity confronting its own creation and where that goes. And in many ways, I think the theme, the underlying message idea, is also very similar. I do admit the motion picture expands on that theme and makes it more about this whole notion of identity, belonging. In many ways, one could even argue the motion picture would have a place today. However, again, as I argued the last time, and I think my esteemed co-counsel, who I shall hand the floor over, will say, and perhaps agree, is that the plot meanders, it plods along. Not only is it inspired by The Changeling, there was a lot of kind of the themes or some of the ideas was merged from Phase 2, which was supposed to be a new Star Trek series to be released. However, you say it with me, everybody, Star Wars introduced the whole idea that, hey, we can make a lot of money in a motion picture. So how about we scrap that TV series and we just go to the big screen? And so in many ways, I think those who are familiar with The Changeling, those who know some of the themes that were introduced or would have been introduced in Phase 2, Star Trek the Motion Picture is truly just kind of a Frankenstein monster, if you will, of those two ideas in a way that I think does not necessarily provide a very good viewing experience. And Joe, if you will, please, let's talk about the pacing. Let's talk about the actual aspects of it as a movie.
Do you want me to speak now, James? Do you want to throw it to
Well, hold on.
Josh?
Yeah. Well, I guess before we get to the pacing and anything else with the actual production of the movie, Joe, do you have anything further to add to what Jack said?
Yeah, I got a little preamble to catch people up, and so
let's hear what your thoughts are about this movie and The Changeling, and then I want to hear from Josh his rebuttal, and then John, I want you weigh in with everything that's just been said.
Okay, I'm going to try to put this in historical cinematic perspective. Okay, so, but I'd like to say once again, I would like to thank the esteemed jurists who have cleared time on their busy dockets to take up the task of rendering a verdict on the merits of an aged piece of 20th century cinema. That said, it is times, it's quite arduous at times to make a clear distinction on the state of this century's cinematic endeavors when one considers it produced such forgettable films as Superman, The Quest for Peace, Dr. Detroit, and Ernest Goes to Jail. That said, this century's produced some stellar offerings that have stood the test of time. The Godfather, The Empire Strikes Back, and Hitchcock's masterpiece, Rebecca. Unfortunately, Star Trek the Motion Picture falls into the forgettable category of cinema history. It attempts to answer big existential questions. I think, therefore I am. but in fact, it fails to answer the queries in entertaining and frankly lively ways of producing a film that would engage an audience. In the vernacular of the 1970s slang, this motion picture was a jive turkey. So that's what I wanted to catch up on there. So now, if you want to talk about the acting, but I'm sure Josh wants to reply to that.
Well, yes, I'm gonna turn it over. So, Josh, with everything that the prosecutors have said, I would have you weigh in with some of your comments about is this motion picture nothing more than a rehash of The Changeling?
Well, I think it is more than a rehash of The Changeling, and something that my esteemed opposing counsel is skirting around is that The Changeling is bad. It's not a good episode. I do believe in that episode. The Nomad probe erases Uhura's memory, reduces her to the mental state of a child, and then she's somehow re-educated in the span of one episode to her former self. I mean, that's pretty silly.
That's Spock's brain silly. I agree with that.
I think I don't know. I prefer Spock's brain to the Changeling. At least it's, I don't know. Spock's brain is one of those episodes that its reputation precedes it, but then when you actually watch the episode, it's not as the problem is the premise, the central image of that episode is silly. But the episode itself, I don't think is actually that awful. I think it actually has some interesting things going for it, but that's a sidebar. I don't know that I would judge a film's quality based on the originality of the premise. I would say that, I think the motion picture does the themes of The Changeling more justice than The Changeling did. And I would also say, just in response to Joe's statement, that it tries to ask these questions and it doesn't come up with a satisfying answer. I think it does. I think the resolution of the motion picture is more satisfying than The Changeling, in that the answer is we need to open up our minds to what the possibilities of life actually are. When Deckard joins with V'ger, that's an act of imagination that results in the creation of a new life form. And I think, seeing as how since our first convening of this tribunal, there's been a lot of discussion about artificial intelligence in the news and stuff like that. And I think Star Trek, on several occasions, but in the motion picture in particular, really asks the question, what is life? What is consciousness, and what is the meaning of all this? And I think what the motion picture is saying, the realization that Spock has, is that in order for this machine to be fulfilled, this machine consciousness to be fulfilled, it needs to become more human. It needs to feel and be irrational and embrace its humanity, essentially. Which I think is a very intriguing and potent statement that reverberates from 1979 all the way to today. Yeah, and as for this being some leftover ideas from the Phase 2 series, that's certainly true. This movie had its origins in the 2-hour pilot for what would have been Star Trek Phase 2. This is sort of a revision of that. I don't quite know why that's a strike against this movie, though. And yeah, and that said, we can move on to discussing, the pacing and the acting and whatever else. I yield the floor, or whatever the term is.
Yes, there you go. Yes.
What do you say?
I have a comment, and then I'll ask a question of the defense here. So a lot comes up about the pacing, both in terms of just I hear that in regular conversations I've had over the years with all of you, with other people. But there is something I've noticed of movies from that era in the 70s, that pacing and maybe you can speak to this more with an expertise. I think were there more experiments with pacing in the 70s in that era of movie making? Because looking back in my own experience, The Godfather, revered as one of the best movies, I think has pacing problems, or at least it is a different feel of pacing than I'm familiar with in many other movies. So it took a different mindset for me to appreciate it. And I do go back with that movie as always to that incredibly well written scene in Family Guy where Peter admits while they're drowning, I think, that he did not like the Godfather movies, and everybody like. And he says it insists upon itself. It insists upon itself, and goes on to talk about the pacing, and it's just two guys in chairs talking Italian to each other the whole time. And I was sitting there watching this. I said, he has a real point, and that is very clearly Seth MacFarlane's voice. Also a huge Trekkie, created a show that is essentially a version of Star Trek: The Next Generation with its own brilliant stories. But pacing can be a major issue. But films in the 70s seem to have some really experimenting some strange things. And is the motion picture doing that? And if so, what was it, a failed experiment or was it a bold experiment? I'll pose that question to you first and then back to the prosecution.
Well, that's an interesting point. I wouldn't. I don't know necessarily that the 70s was a time of experimentation in terms of pacing in films. I do think the pacing was more deliberate and slower in the 70s, and I think there was less formula in terms of what the narrative moments are that you have to hit and by when. In the 80s and the 90s, there were, screenplay formulas, and there was a lot of thinking about like, okay, by page 15, you have to introduce this element, and by page 33, you have to introduce this element. And I think films before the 80s and 90s, so in the 70s and prior, were more intuitive and by the seat of their pants in terms of the pacing and how a story unfolds, how a narrative unfolds. I would say that the motion picture has a pace different from an episode of Star Trek, and certainly different from Star Wars. Star Wars, it's hard to imagine now because of how filmic language has evolved in the last 40 some odd years. But Star Wars was very, very fast, and that was an innovation at the time. And Star Trek: The Motion Picture was not intentionally reacting to Star Wars by going the other way, but it was very deliberately trying to be a different kind of film, the likes of which I don't think we really see those longer contemplative cerebral sci-fi films anymore. They do have some aspect of that action adventure strand of DNA that the market seems to dictate sci-fi films have. What is interesting is that this is just occurring to me now. A movie that comes to mind that's also directed by Robert Wise is The Andromeda Strain, from the early 70s, which is another film that at its core has a very high concept, kind of thrilling sci-fi premise. But the film itself is very slow and very deliberate and very talky. And it's interesting that both The Andromeda Strain and Star Trek: The Motion Picture were directed by Robert Wise. But yeah, you don't really see movies like that anymore. Like they did a remake of The Andromeda Strain a few years ago, and it's like 90% of the things that I enjoyed about the original film, it makes you realize had to do with the style and the vibe and the tone and frankly the pacing of that 1970s version. The new version just really felt sensationalized and sillier, and you took it less seriously because it was sort of like movieized. I think the deliberate pacing of films in the 70s, again, it's not for generations who are not used to films moving that way. I think you need to maybe go one extra step to get yourself in that mindset. But yeah, I would say it was an experiment, but not necessarily in the way you mean. I think it was an experiment in terms of what is the big screen version of Star Trek going to be like. And I think what they were trying to do was they were trying to make the movie version of Star Trek distinct from the TV series Star Trek. And the model that they were using was that 2001: A Space Odyssey, Andromeda Strain, cerebral and at times self-important, but a profound mode of science fiction that I think Star Trek: The Motion Picture is the last example of, frankly.
So, as we, with those thoughts to the prosecution, are you, when you guys are talking about pacing, especially Joe, since this I think was more the point you were bringing up in our last episode, are you viewing it through the time, or are you viewing it through the time now in terms of its pacing problems?
I'm viewing it through the execution of the film. The director of the film. I lived through those times. I remember films like The Sting and Godfather 1 and 2, which were not fast-paced films, but they are great American films. They are just great films. The Sting is one of the greatest movies of all time. And it's not, it's not a shoot 'em up. It's not anything like that. But you can tell a film in a quote unquote slow pace, but you've got to execute it properly. And I think that has something to do with the actors involved, with the script, obviously. If the film is moving at a slow pace, am I interested in what they're saying? You said, John, before that Peter says two Italian guys sitting down talking in Italian. Well, there's a lot of dialogue in The Godfather, Part 1 and Part 2, but it's riveting because you realize what these mobster families are doing, and what Michael Corleone, turns into a monster by the second film, what he's planning and executing. And I don't think it's a problem of pacing so much as a problem of execution. And I think we talked about the first English line spoken in the film in the prior episode by the person who was not an actor. We have characters in this film, beloved characters from the series, who have nothing to do. Uhura, Sulu, Scotty. Why are they even there? Chekhov gets to scream because he was the best screamer. He admitted that. But you have these gems. Use them. Find a way to work them into the story, and that'll take care of your pacing problems, because you're so fascinated by these beloved characters. If they're sitting around and having a moment with each other, you're not going to think it's slow. You're going to think it's interesting.
So, Joe, your thing is like the pacing is not the problem; it's the fact there's nothing interesting to fill the space.
Yeah, it's just we're in space, we're in a void, and there's a void inside the Enterprise too.
So, Jack, do you have additional comments about the pacing issue?
Sure. I mean, I think there's probably 3 points that I would like to raise with respect to the pacing. And so, I mean, obviously, I think we're trying to look back in 1979 and get a sense of what other movies were out there, because obviously pacing of movies in the modern era have changed significantly from 1979. But just to give you a sense, Alien was released in 1979. Moonraker was released in 1979. Apocalypse Now, The Warriors, Mad Max, Rocky 2 was released in 1979. The Amityville Horror. And so I raised those movies because those are very dynamic movies. Even in the time, they found a way to tell a story that kept a certain amount of forward momentum. I feel, just to agree with my esteemed co-counsel, this is, I think, one of the challenges that Star Trek: The Motion Picture has, is it doesn't necessarily maintains that forward momentum. I think it opens very strong. I think there's a kind of the threat that's presented, redesign, the refit of the Enterprise, and obviously what has now just become standard kind of surrounding and the looking at the ship from many different angles, and just the oogling and the ogling of the new design, and so that it set all of that in motion. So I think that's the first thing. Second, I didn't think I would be this guy who's doing this, but I'm gonna have to defend The Godfather, and I'll tell you why. And again, just to echo, my esteemed co-counsel. In many ways, I think people misinterpret what The Godfather does well, and one of the most subtle things that The Godfather does is it actually tells you the theme outside of the main characters and their interaction. The theme is family, and it is a movie. If you actually watch it, someone is always doing something in the background. There is always something happening in the background that essentially is the backdrop of why all of the people in the foreground are doing what they're doing. And so it's one of those and I think Francis Ford Coppola was brilliant in the way that he can actually both deliver in the dialogue and in the plot what the story is about, but the subtext is always surrounding. It opens with a wedding. I mean, someone is cooking. There's someone always and so all of that is fundamentally, and it's very, I think, subliminal, but it really drives home the point. And so yes, there's a lot of talking. There's a lot of what would seem as not necessarily quick dynamic pacing, but there's always a lot of energy around those characters. And these are characters who you've never seen. Some of them are not even named, but essentially that just carries a certain amount of energy that really keeps the movie going. And which now goes to my third point. And I think, again, my esteemed co-counsel was correct, is you have all of these characters, and most of them, it's just glorified cameos, and they are there. They're not really doing anything. The movie feels claustrophobic. It feels as if it's trying to breathe. They go into space, but they don't go anywhere fundamentally. Because if you were to sit down and think about what happens, there's a threat, they're on Earth, they kind of come together, wormhole, photon torpedo, and then essentially they spend most of the time within V'ger. And so for a movie that's supposed to be expansive and to go out into the space and to explore, they spend all of their time in a very insular kind of environment. And so it's for me anyway, I find it, and I think this is what leads to the pacing problem, is I feel like I am on a cruise ship and I can't get off until we hit the next port of call.
Where's Captain Stubing?
Well, you wish, or even Doc, or Isaac, your bartender. I mean, so and so I think in many ways, I think we now equate that with pacing, because that is essentially kind of our modern understanding of when a movie kind of falters. That's typically something that I think is much more obvious. And so even if you were to say, and to my esteemed opposing counsel's point of view, the story has big ideas. The story kind of swings for the fences, but it's told in such a very confined area, that it almost works against the story that it's trying to tell. Because one of the things that I wrote is, it's one of the very few movies, when you sit down and you think about it, once you get past the beginning and the Klingons get killed, it is not a dystopian AI story. It's essentially an AI seeking belonging. It's an AI seeking purpose, and not for malicious intent. And so that's a story I don't even think we make anymore. I think Creator maybe kind of touched on it, but we saw that. But anyway, and so I think for the time, and again, as my esteemed opposing counsel said, is now with artificial intelligence being part of the zeitgeist, and it's something that we're all talking about now. In 1979, for that story to kind of tackle that subject matter, even before they even had a true sense of what it would look like, but to essentially humanize it in the nature of the characters and even in the desires of the V'ger probe, I think was pretty revolutionary. The problem is it has no space for the story to grow, and so then There is you don't even really get there until Elia and Decker merge at the end. That is perhaps the largest expanse or the large. Oh, great show! But that's the area in which the show actually starts to become larger than itself visually, because film is a visual medium that allows the audience to go along for the ride. Other than that, honestly, it almost feels like a bottle episode. Other than the fact that there are some of those scenes outside the ship, but everything happens on the Enterprise until they actually get onto the probe. So I think I'll just rest there. Thank you very much. I yield my time.
Yeah, John, I actually wanted you to weigh in, like your response and then your actual thoughts about the pacing of this movie.
And I'm really grateful for all of you, because now we've taken it from the concept of pacing purely as a time-based phenomenon to giving it the dimension of, well, what is in the space for that time, and that really expands out what we're talking about. So, which is, and just to clarify, I was quoting Peter Griffin, my own opinion on The Godfather.
We know that, John.
Very much,
I totally understand.
Like in those situations, I never had the experience of watching it straight through until much later in life. It was always on cable TV. So when you watch 45 minutes here and 45 minutes there, you also lose any sense of pacing, and it feels even longer, which coincidentally is also how I first experienced Star Trek: The Motion Picture. It was not as a singular experience. It was on television at some point. Then I did rent it back in the day from Salem Drugs.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
We did not hit it. But that was after.
They're no longer there, by the way. They're gone.
No, they've moved. They're just in a smaller space.
Yeah,
they still do not have VHSs anymore. They're down by there next to Let There Be Bagels.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. So God, things change. And
Yes.
I go back to I had previously taken out Star Trek 2 probably 4 or 5 times before going into the motion picture. So obviously that informed my view as to what a Star Trek movie was like. And then there was this, which I'd experienced in bits and pieces. But I'm fascinated with the idea of time. It did take place in the Enterprise. It did just take place in the Enterprise, essentially, and then V'ger. And V'ger had all these expansive sets, different special effects, really some mind-boggling, and industry, shattering industry expectations as to what special effects could be done, and that was very impressive. But the word claustrophobia stands out to me because that is, again, I think, like we were talking about pacing, that is based on the content of the space. And Josh, I think it was you who recommended a movie to me years ago, Jerome Bixby's Man from Earth. Brilliant movie. If anyone has not watched it, and I spoiler alert, pause here if you're going to watch it. But the storyline is brilliant, about a man who does not necessarily appear to what he makes, and makes a claim as to never having had died, and being tens of thousands of years old, just never having died. And it's a story of inquiry from this professor and the staff that he's trying to essentially get away from so he can create a new identity. But they all
have a sequel, by the way.
Surprisingly, party.
Yes, they did.
And that party is all in this very small house, 2 or 3 rooms maybe in the house where they interact on the outside porch. And it goes on. And it is a movie that is essentially dialogue. And dialogue heavy. It is not special effects. It is not any action scenes. I found the movie compelling on so many levels. Incredibly cerebral, but the content of the characters, all the different, because there were at least 8 people on screen, in many scenes, all with their own backstories, all with their own perspectives on this question as to, would it be possible for this man to be telling the truth that he's tens of thousands of years old and just simply hasn't died and stopped aging at 40? And each one of them have their own challenges and difficulties, and you got to know each character to an extent. The depth in that small space, and then I remember this was originally conceived of as more of a play and a novel, and I think it was done as a play at one point, or at least it certainly felt like a play. And when you look at plays, small sets, small environment, audience all surrounding, we're not sitting there saying, oh, this is so claustrophobic, because the characters are there. And if that's the failure of Star Trek: The Motion Picture, that's an intriguing point, that what Jack goes on to say with the remaining cast members outside of Kirk, you get a lot of Spock, you get Decker, and you get Ilia. You don't.
Mhm.
You do feel like it is cameo appearances from the rest. Sadly,
Mhm.
they relied on the fact that fans knew who these characters were and could rely on that they are here. And I am curious whether the novelization gave more either more time or more depth to the remaining characters. I do feel that the remaining movies, so the movies that followed, uh, did give the characters a little more, if not screen time, certainly flavor. And that is certainly epitomized by Star Trek 4, The Voyage Home.
Oh yes. Yep.
Every character had a moment, even if they were on screen a lot. We could all quote lines. Scotty and the the now really thinking how awful that term is when he goes, humpbacked people, whales in Scott, whales. It's such a, oh god, that is a cringeworthy line now, but also
Yeah.
still hilarious as ever. It gave them a moment of
Yeah.
Scotty,
Nuclear vessels.
nuclear whistles, and
In Alameda.
Alameda, and
What is it?
Uhura coming to the rescue, and of course,
Oh yeah.
every character had their moment, and you felt joyed to see them on screen. Which, side note, was something they did really well in Star Trek Picard season 3. The characters that
Oh
they brought
yes.
in from Next Gen, which essentially ended up as a reunion, they gave them some real uh, uh, time and space. And if that's the fault
All
of
the
this
story
movie,
arcs. Yeah.
I see that as a valid criticism because you got a great intro with Bones, grizzled beard. I wanted so much
Yeah.
more. I wanted to see my grumpy doctor be
Mm.
grumpy and really give something of that. And looking back, there is a sideline. I'm persuaded by that argument, Josh. I want to give you a chance to kind of counteract that, but I feel like we were sort of sidelined by these characters were sidelined. We weren't given that depth, and the very aesthetic of the movie. I'm looking at a picture here of it was very washed out, and that's how I think of the characters as washed out. That you get a washed out version of Chekhov of Uhura. Scotty has a neat, scene getting the warp drive online and losing somebody in the transporter accident. There are some classic Scotty moments. You do get that from Scotty. Um, uh, is there much more? No, but I could forgive that if they had at least given that amount to everybody. But there was something missing. I didn't know who these people were except for having been familiar with the original series as it was. The movie didn't give me the sense of who the rest of them were.
Yeah. I just before you move on, I just want to say one thing. To John's point, there's a scene in the film as the Enterprise is entering the cloud, Vija. McCoy comes onto the bridge, stands behind Kirk, doesn't utter a line of dialogue, and then walks off stage, so to speak.
Huh.
Why even put him there? I mean, have him say something. So yeah, that bothered me back then, and it still bothers me today. That one scene is just
And never pass up a moment for a Bones quip. Like,
yeah.
if he can make a comment,
God damn it, Jim! Something
I'm
like
gonna
that.
I'm gonna say something perhaps a bit controversial, and I hope I don't offend anybody when I say this. But the characters that we think of now as these beloved characters, in the original series, I would go as far to say they were glorified, day players in the original series. They didn't get a lot of screen time. They certainly didn't do a lot of heavy lifting in terms of the plot. Every once in a while, like they would have a scene here or there that they were the driving force of, but very rarely were they featured in any significant way on the TV series. And I think when you watch the motion picture, they were essentially there because the fans wanted to see them, because they had grown in popularity in the intervening years through conventions and fan fiction, and really grew in the minds of fandom. to be, fully fleshed out important characters that, going just off the TV series, they really were not. And I think they certainly became that. And as the films went on, the actors who played them, Nichelle Nichols, Walter Koenig, and George Takei certainly demanded more to do. Something that is very interesting about the claustrophobia and how, a lot happens on the Enterprise and you feel sort of stuck. A couple things about that. Number one, I kind of like that feel because it kind of places you in the headspace of the characters themselves. Like, they are all alone. It's sort of like a submarine. It's like, they are all alone on this starship. They're out there with just the hull of the ship between them and the void of space, and this great unknown alien intelligence that is coming to eradicate the human race. I think it actually creates tension there. But the other thing that I will say, though, is that it's possible Star Trek the Motion Picture's fundamental flaw is that Star Trek the TV series, in a strange way, you could kind of think of as like a workplace drama.
Mm-hmm.
And, that kind of construction is very suitable for TV. It's a place that you go every week and there's a new problem, a new scenario. When you try to take that and make it a motion picture, which, like you were saying, Jack, demands, more visuals, a broader scope. It's very hard to do that when the confines of the show really revolve around this confined space, which is the bridge and corridors and other places aboard the Starship Enterprise. And I think it is interesting that you do have this movie that is trying to be spectacle. It very clearly is. It's like, with all the special effects sequences, with the scale that it tries to convey, with both the size of the Enterprise herself, and then also comparing the tiny speck of the Enterprise to the vast expanse of V'ger. They do try to lean heavily into the spectacle as a justification for the whole exercise of making a motion picture. But at the same time, the format of Star Trek demands that they do spend a lot of time stuck on the ship. And I think, so if, Star Trek the Motion Picture has a fundamental flaw, I think it may lie in, I don't think, in some ways, Star Trek is ill-suited to be a motion picture. I think it's better suited as a TV series with a new adventure every week. And Jack, you said something very interesting. You felt like you were trapped on a cruise ship, waiting for the next port of call. Like, if you were watching the TV series, you would have gotten the next port of call the following week. I mean, that's a part of the pleasure of watching a TV series that this film lacks. So, I mean, those were just some thoughts I had while you guys were talking. I'm trying to bring this in for a landing here, but I don't.
You're doing fine. You're doing fine. You're doing great.
Yeah,
I think I might be able to help with that, Josh. I thought about that too. Like, the spectacle of the motion picture, I think, gets in the way of the emotionality of the characters. This is why Star Trek, with few exceptions, the Ratnakon, Voyage Home, First Contact, has always worked better on the small screen. I think Star Trek, you're right. I think I'm going to have to agree with you there. Star Trek was made for the small screen because it's introspective. It's about the human adventure that this movie had a tagline for, which didn't work for me. But that is what Star Trek is about. It's not about, as we said before, it's not about explosions in space. It's not about space battles. I want to take one exception to, yes, you're right about the other characters not moving the plot along many times, but they had their fair share. And I'm thinking of Uhura right now, and Imud, Plato's Stepchildren, Mira Mira, Gamesters of Triskelion, especially Mira Mira. I loved Uhura and Mira Mira,
Yes.
especially because of the cutoff, the
Changeling.
Changeling, yeah.
Changeling.
But you pointed out how stupid that was, and I agree. That whole, re-educating her, that sounds like something out of a Stalinistic work camp.
Right, exactly.
Re-education.
Bluey.
Right?
Bluey?
Bluey?
That doesn't fit with me, re-education. I don't like that term.
Yes.
So, yeah, eventually I think this movie, shot for the stars, no pun intended, but I think it was presented in the wrong venue, or as we would say today, probably on the wrong platform. It should have been a two-parter episode on a TV series and not a motion picture.
Yeah, I don't even know that I would argue that. I certainly have a great affinity for this film. Is it the greatest thing Star Trek has ever produced? I don't think I could go that far. But I'm glad that this kind of Star Trek exists. Would I want it to be the only flavor of Star Trek that exists? No. But I feel like, this shows the elasticity, the capability of the format of Star Trek. I like that Star Trek can go here.
Okay.
Just not every week.
Yeah.
Not every week, exactly.
So Joe and Jack, I don't know how normal court proceedings work. I don't know if the prosecution or the defendant get to make their final arguments. Jack, you would probably be able to tell me more than I.
Prosecution will make the first closing argument, because essentially they had to prove everything, all of the elements in their case, whereas the defendant just basically has to say they didn't prove their case.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. So Jack and Joe, I'm going to give you the floor to make your final arguments. Josh, you can make your final arguments, and then John, you and I can render a verdict. So Jack or Joe, I don't know who wants to. If you're doing
Joe, would you like to go first?
Let me go first because I think I just made my final argument about it belonging on the small screen. So I yield to my esteemed colleague who's obviously much better educated in this field of endeavor than I am. So take it away, Jack.
So one of the things, and I mentioned this in our first episode before the numerous delays, which I blame myself, just submitting my delay request. But I go back to perhaps the most renowned film critic of our time, Roger Ebert. And there are two things that I'd like to bring. And so the first thing is his review of the motion picture, and he had given it 3 stars. And in many ways, he felt that it was a good movie, but he also felt that there was definitely something lacking. And so one of the things that he says, and I'm just going to quote, he says, "But now we get to the human level, or the half-human level in the case of Mr. Spock. The characters in this movie are part of our cultural folklore. The Star Trek television episodes have been rerun time and time again. Trekkies may be unhappy with me for saying this, but there are ways in which our familiarity with the series works against the effectiveness of this movie. On the one hand, we have incomprehensible alien forces and the plot that reaches out to the edge of the galaxy. On the other hand, confronting these vast forces, we have television pop heroes. It's great to enjoy the in-jokes involving the relationships of the Enterprise crew members, and it's great that Trekkies can pick up references meant for them, but the extreme familiarity of Star Trek characters somehow tends to break the illusion of the big scenes involving the alien ship. Such reservations aside, Star Trek motion picture is probably about as good as we could have expected. It lacks the dazzling brilliance and originality of 2001, which was an extraordinary one-of-a-kind film, but on its own terms, it's a very well-made piece of work with an interesting premise. The alien spaceship turns out to come from a mechanical or computer civilization, one produced by artificial intelligence, and yet poignantly human in the sense that it has come all this way to seek out the secrets of its own origins as we might. And so I feel in many ways I echo in the course of my discussion today, that was, I felt some of the strengths of the movie. I would, however, like to quote Roger Ebert came out with a book called Roger Ebert's 4-Star Reviews. And there's something that's very profound that he put in the beginning, the opening of the book, that I think really captures why we go to the movies. And so his line there is, I have become convinced in the process that cinema is the best medium yet devised for observing, sharing, and shaping human experience. And so taking that into consideration, I feel in many ways the movie just fell short in truly expanding upon our human experience. As my esteemed co-counsel said, although that was the tagline of the movie when it was established, it in itself does not necessarily allow the human experience to grow over the course of the movie. As I said, in many ways, the claustrophobic feel, the very kind of confined spaces in which it places the characters and the story, just all makes it feel very pedestrian. And so, although I think it played a very great role in creating the bridge between the TV series to the franchise as we know it and understand it today, I think standing on its own as a piece of film that we can watch, a piece of cinema, it does not, in and of itself, independently or even with the background and understanding of who the characters are, truly expands our knowledge and allows us to have a deep connection with the characters, which essentially should always drive a story forward.
Well, that's very interesting. Well, that's very interesting that you single out that Roger Ebert quote about. Could you read it again?
Surely,
that cinema is a way to share the human experience.
Yes. He said, I said, when I started the job, I thought I would do it for 5 years. Now it has become a lifetime. I've become convinced in the process that the cinema is the best medium yet devised for observing, sharing, and shaping human experience.
It's very interesting that that's what you chose to close on, because I would argue that this film does share a lot about the human experience. I think it relates a human experience that you couldn't have anywhere else. I would even go as far to say is that it tries to broaden the human experience. I think none of us have encountered a machine, a living machine that is looking for God. And I think that sharing that experience of this starship crew, human crew, wrestling with this very thorny problem of how to help a machine find God, really makes you start to think about larger questions in, your own life and how you perceive existence and all that. So I actually think, if you're using that as a measure to judge the quality or effectiveness of a film, I think in a lot of ways, Star Trek: The Motion Picture, excels in that regard. I think I get that this isn't everyone's a cup of tea. I think at the end of the day, I don't know that it's necessarily objective measures that are objective flaws with the movie. I think a lot of it boils down to a question of preference and taste. And that said, I think we can all agree, and I know, Jack, you alluded to this already, but I think it bears repeating. Like, I just can't bring myself to dislike a movie that gave us the refit Enterprise, that Jerry Goldsmith score, sets that were used until the end of Star Trek Enterprise in 2005. It gave us the Klingons as we know them, and in a lot of ways was a prototype, a template for Star Trek: The Next Generation. Which I think is among the best that Star Trek has to offer. I think in a lot of ways the motion picture is kind of the missing link between the original series and Next Generation. I really love this movie. I have a good time with it, but I don't begrudge anyone who doesn't. The defense rests.
Very well put. Thank you, both the prosecution and the defense. So, John, before I throw it over to us, I'm just going to clarify that we are making a judgment, not it is the best Star Trek movie, nor is it the best piece of Star Trek pop culture or display of all Star Trek, of all the franchise combined. But we are making a judgment on whether or not this is a worthy entry. And Josh, you can correct me if I'm going to misphrase your point, is if this was a worthy entry, if someone was to discover Star Trek, I think Josh would say this is a worthy thing for them to explore and see and not leave off the table. Would that be a good thing to judge? That it's something that anyone who loves Star Trek, they should see this movie at least once.
Oh,
and
definitely.
If you're new Star Trek, you should be seeing it. So this is what we're judging upon. Does that some fair?
Yeah, see it, and maybe even like it. Like what I'm trying to dispel is this idea that this is a movie worthy of scorn. I think a lot of people go into it with its reputation preceding it, and then their experience of the film is colored by the fact that they know everyone hates this movie.
Okay, perfect. All right, so John, I'm going to give you the first volley of your final thoughts and your decision or your judgment.
And we are here to make quite the determination. Does Data have a soul? Wait. Something else.
Awesome.
Perhaps not as grand a pronouncement that we will make today, but I like the context of where our judgment comes down. Is it worthy of somebody who enjoys Star Trek taking the time and appreciating it, and even perhaps enjoying it? I would say yes. It is an unnecessary yes. I do not think the film reaches the level of necessary if one is to get a breadth of Star Trek, particularly if they are new to Star Trek or trying to get into it. It is worthy of anyone who is a fan of the series and wants to look at something that was expected of Star Trek at that time, and it wasn't expected of it at any point. And that was for it to be a grand cinematic artistic experience. And I think while it's a swing and a miss on that note, it's not for lack of effort, and it's not lack for having excellent players, directors, and certainly composers, but it doesn't live up to that attempt. I don't think that means you shouldn't watch it. I don't think it means that it should be discarded. There are plenty of movies that should be discarded and sort of, we don't need to preserve those or go back to those. This is worthy of being preserved. It's worthy of being respected for what it tried to do. And I am incredibly convinced by Josh's closing statement there that it gave us the template for what came later. It was a film that had the pieces. And it's like they didn't quite know what to do with them yet, but they knew that these pieces were great. They knew that these pieces had potential. Trying your first attempt out as a movie and being as grandiose to call it the motion picture, I think sort of told you where they were at when making this movie, that they may have gone a little far in their grandiosity, but the pieces were brilliant. And I think that really gave us something to appreciate later on, because it was the sets that went on. It was the music, that theme. I don't think to anybody doesn't immediately trigger a visceral emotional response. We think of it as the Next Generation theme, but it's the theme from Star Trek: The Motion Picture. It's the theme later used again in Star Trek V. Sadly, also not a great movie. But as I've said in other reviews here, it may have the best first 5 minutes of any of the films. From my emotional relation to just seeing it, and then it just, well, it doesn't continue on that path, we'll say. But the music and everything else. So what it gave us was incredible. I think it's worth going back to. And there are, of course, huge questions of preference. Everybody will have that in terms of what their aesthetic appreciation for something is. It tried for a great philosophical question. I think it actually managed to delve deep in that successfully and give us some interesting answers to it. I think by the time it got there, sadly, we may have lost some interest because there was something missing in the direction of the movie, and I haven't been convinced otherwise that it was there. Something was missing, and we talked about pacing. Was it the pacing? Was it the characters not getting enough screen time or focus or development? There was something almost intangible missing from the movie, and maybe that's only because it was their opening attempt at a film. We go to a very different film in Star Trek 2, followed by Star Trek 3, very similar. Very different film in Star Trek 4, then 5, the aforementioned 5. And then Star Trek 6, a bit of a return to form to 2, but something that brought together the idea of let's tackle a grand, relevant philosophical concept to the time, at that point, the end of the Cold War. So I think that this movie, for lack of a better term, walked so that the rest could run, but it also opened up the space that Star Trek could go incredibly deep. And Next Generation did that. Next Generation took this template, and in individual episodes could go so deep. And looking back, sometimes they were very cerebral, not action-based, not necessarily compelling from that adrenaline pumping mindset. But we look back and say, wow, inner light. Wow. That is something that you would not normally attempt, and I don't think you would have been able to attempt episodes like that without a movie like this. So that's where I give this movie a huge amount of credit. And as any good judge would do, I had to do some research, on the legal questions, in front of us, see what the case law was, and whether it's appropriate to bring in or not. The novel gives us perspective on where Roddenberry's head was, at least when writing the movie. If looking at that novelization, there was behind it this attempt to show this grand vision of where humanity's going by constantly asking questions and encountering new forms of life, new forms of things that humanity created and didn't expect to happen. So I definitely see that. I do wish that we'd gotten more about the New Humans and how Kirk regarded himself as almost primitive by comparison to the New Humans. And I think I read one review which said that Next Generation was, and this is why I agree with the idea that this movie as the missing link or the connective tissue between the original series and Next Generation. Next Generation is meant to be the presentation of the New Human, at least to some extent. But I think it is the connective tissue between the two, and it walked so Next Generation could run, so that the rest of them could run. And I'm appreciative for it on that, but that does not mean I'm gonna watch it again. I did watch the 4K remaster and appreciated it. I'm good.
Very nice, John. So I thank you all for taking the time to be here and reconvene again to discuss this topic. Having listened to everything, I will say, I think, especially for John and Josh, you and we've known each other for like 30 years at least, right?
Yeah.
I'm 43. We met around when I was like 12, 13, I'm guessing, something like that. So I'm going to say that I went most of that time without seeing the motion picture and really enjoyed Star Trek. It's only until the 4K version came out that I actually sat and watched this movie all the way through. It's the first time ever. It's possible I saw it earlier, but not enough to in my memory bank. So I'm going to answer the question that you probably can go through an entire lifetime, or at least part of a lifetime, loving Star Trek and never seeing the motion picture. I agree with a lot of what Jack and Joe have said. It did feel claustrophobic to me. I love character dialogue. Character dialogue is my favorite part of a lot of movies, especially our pop culture movies. I for all the flack that Age of Ultron, Avengers Age of Ultron gets, I love the character interactions in that movie. The way Tony and and Steve interact, the way that Banner and Natasha interact. I'm all there for that stuff, even though the rest of the movie is nonsense. So
that is our next case. Yeah.
yeah. So I'm here for character interactions, and I don't think I got enough of that to the point of the prosecution. And it did feel like a little bit of a bottled episode. Watching The Changeling, which is probably the first. I've only watched the episodes probably all once through. As I've said many times offline to you guys, I feel ill-equipped to actually be the head Commodore here, considering everyone else's Star Trek knowledge compared to mine. However, rewatching The Changeling for a second time, I felt like there was a lot of re-storytelling that went into the motion picture. But again, I go to Josh's point, though. I don't know if that necessarily makes the plot of the motion picture bad, because it's reusing an idea that it previously had. So with that being said, I will say, though, when I did sit down and watch the movie all the way through, one, I enjoyed it a lot more than I thought I was going to. Two, I would say that even though I went through most of my lifetime without seeing this movie and being a Star Trek fan, filling in that gap of Spock's transition from the original series Spock to the Wrath of Khan / rest of Spock's lifetime in the Star Trek universe, it really did something for me to see this go from pure logic to find the balance between being logical and being human, for lack of a better phrase. It was good to see. I mean, obviously the music. I've had the soundtrack to Star Trek: The Motion Picture long before I actually had ever seen the movie, so I love the music, the creation of the Klingons, and obviously that is the best looking Enterprise of any movie of any of the franchises. So while it's a close decision in my mind in some regards, I am also going to have to agree with Josh's point on Star Trek: The Motion Picture. So I thank the prosecution. You did a wonderful job here. All your points were well taken, well thought out, and well presented. Josh, you did a fantastic job presenting all your points. And I also want to thank Josh for being a good sport through all of these years of the podcast and taking all of this ribbing and flack. Because there was, like I said, that was episode 7 of the podcast, and we're almost approaching 200. So it's been a long time.
You finally have your day in court.
Yeah, finally day in court. So I would say, Josh, you've won not only your case point, but you've also won what you are best suited for: command of a starship, and continue to command of podcasts and host them.
Your first best destiny.
Well, thank you. I believe we've witnessed the birth of a new life form.
Okay, all right. Well, congratulations, Josh. You deserve this.
Thank you.
That was
very
well defended. Very well
You got to
defended.
use the Strange New Worlds episode title, Ad Astra per Aspera. To the stars through hardships. Yeah, because I think that's sort of what this movie is. You get through the hardship. It actually is. It is doing something.
I like my favorite tagline better. You will believe a man can fly.
And I will say, as we wrap this episode up, I had no idea it was also going to turn into a defense of The Godfather or a Godfather podcast. It seems like I know Joe mentioned this offline. It seems like The Godfather, talking about it as a whole, might be its own separate episode in the future. So,
I'm down for that. I'm down for that episode.
So we witnessed the birth of The Godfather podcast at the end of the story.
We need to find someone who doesn't like The Godfather.
Yes.
Is that possible?
I think we got to bring Peter Griffin or see if we can get in touch with
Peter Griffin. Give Stephen Farland a call.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I'd like to
Godfather.
give him a piece of my mind.
I to this day, and I think it applies to so many movies, including the motion picture. It insists upon itself. I love that line so much.
That is brilliant.
It does. It does insist upon itself. I will give you that. It certainly does insist upon itself.
Yeah. You take from that what you will as a viewer, and you're like, okay, but it was trying real hard. But trying hard is not a bad thing. So
no.
Sometimes you notice it more than other times, and you notice it with this one.
Well, I'm going to bring these proceedings to a close. We are finally wrapping up. Yes, dun, or if I had a gavel, I could yeah, there you go.
Very good.
So, as we wrap this up, I once again want to give a spotlight and a shout out to everyone who made this possible. So thank you, Joe, for being here.
Oh, you're welcome, James. This was a real hoot. I really enjoyed this. This was great.
And thank you, Jack, for being here.
Thank you. This was amazing. Josh, you were amazing opposing counsel. It was two against one, and you held your own. So
Yeah,
congratulations.
thank
That
you
was
so
you
much.
awesome.
really did. Yeah, a little rope a dope there at the end, but you pulled it through.
Yes.
John, thank you for being here.
Glad to be here.
And Josh, again, thank you for doing this, for agreeing to it, and for being a good sport about the whole thing.
I bet you redesigned the whole sickbay too. I know you. You love to change things.
And with that, listening audience, if you've enjoyed this episode, we'd love to hear from you about it when it's posted. So if you can go to the Facebook group, Secret Origins of Mint Condition, and post your thoughts about Star Trek The Motion Picture, we'd love to see them. You can also follow us on Instagram at Secret Origins MC. And if you are listening to this podcast and you haven't taken a moment to do so, we'd really appreciate if you're listening to on Spotify, giving us a 5-star rating. If you're listening us into Apple iTunes, if you could give us a 5-star rating and even a quick review, because if you're enjoying this podcast, we would like to expand it out and have it reach more people, and that will open the opportunity for us to maybe get a guest like Seth MacFarlane or something like that if this podcast gets more notoriety. So I appreciate you listening. And what's this? Oh, we finally got Chris out of the transport beam. Excellent. Okay, so we finally got Chris is alive. He's well, and we will talk to you on the next episode. Energize. All right, and we're back for a few moments. Chris, we just beamed you in. It was a little nerve-wracking because I thought we were going to lose you in the transporter.
We had to boost him out of game to get you in, Chris.
Yes,
hang on. I've got a killer headache. I'm gonna need you guys to talk one at a time because there are 4 of you right now.
Well, that transporter stuff is delicate. But through the miracle of StarFleet technology, even
It'll pass. It's okay.
Well, while Chris is recovering from his transporter sickness, it was the miracle of Starfleet technology. While we were recording that episode, we were able to beam it into the pattern buffer, so he was able to hear it also. Yeah. So,
amazing,
Chris, you heard the final judgment, yeah. And do you think that John and I ruled correctly in the case against Josh?
I think it felt a little bit like the goal post shifted a little bit as we got into the second episode, which kind of makes sense. There was a year between episode 1 and episode 2, right? Yeah. And so I think the goalpost shifted just a little bit. I think the argument evolved a little bit. I thought it was a very, very nice piece of litigating by Josh to use Jack's quote against him. In those closing statements, I think it was Ebert's review. Yes. Yeah. So I thought that was a slick piece of litigating that Jack, points deducted, poor form. But I think that by the standards set in the second episode, the judgment made sense. But I actually disagreed, especially in the standards, in my opinion, set in the first episode. I think Josh is an excellent representative of the film. I think he does a great job of really speaking to, opinion versus objectively good film, objectively bad film. But for me, for me, one of the biggest things was looking at the film. I don't know. I still felt as though I guess if we're going by the law of the prosecution has the burden of proving guilt. I don't know. I guess I do. I guess I kind of disagree with the judgment that you and John handed down. I think that had I been sitting in with you for the honor of the court, I would have said, okay, I'm torn enough that I would have written with the majority, but I would have had a little bit of dissent in there too. Because I think that what it came back to for me was this did not feel like a good representation of Star Trek in that medium. I think I still come back to, I'm sure it would have made a fine novel. But in terms of film, it's not just that it doesn't do it for me. I personally, and again, limited understanding, right? I think this is where Josh is a monster, a big, loving, caring, positive monster. But he knows his film, and this is something where I think I struggle. And John had mentioned, if this is on stage. I think Jack had also brought up, if this is something that's on stage, you don't necessarily feel it's claustrophobic with those characters, despite not having the expanse of space in which to work like we did in film. But I personally don't feel as though it's a good representation of Star Trek. I think that some of the things that make Star Trek so wonderful are its diversity, which we don't get a lot of in this film, because we see those characters, that diversity of representation. We see it really minimized and reduced to one liners and mere presence. I think that some of the exploration of what it means to be human is there, which I find interesting, but did not get an exploration of space. That doesn't mean they need to necessarily go far, but I don't get the Trek part of Star Trek in this film. And I can tell you that as someone who does not consider myself a Trekkie, enjoys Star Trek, but is by no means a Trekkie, and I do have to go out of my way to watch Star Trek. It's not something I do on a whim. If this movie were my introduction to it, you would have to work very, very hard to get me to watch more Star Trek. And it's not just an action thing for me. So I felt like the storytelling was very limited. It felt like a very small story. I don't know, how am I going to phrase this? It felt like, you know what? This is where I do agree with the prosecution. If it, to me, it doesn't entirely feel. If I agree with the prosecution in it feeling claustrophobic, it feels like a small story being writ large in a small space, and I feel like those things don't work for me. So I thought the prosecution did a nice job of sort of maybe encapsulating that, and bringing that argument to the floor. Yeah, I think I disagreed. I could be made to agree with my fellow judges, which is why, like, if I were voting with you, if I were there at the time and not stuck in the damn transporter, I wouldn't necessarily have the space for this dissent, especially because, again, Josh makes a very compelling argument. But
he did. I mean, his defense, and probably to my fault, I didn't fully define his point in the first part. Like, originally, like, going back, like, I thought he was defending, because the original episode we spoke about, like, the episode 7 of the podcast was like, what is your greatest Star Trek thing of all time? Which he did list Star Trek the motion picture.
Yeah.
But having redefined those, I didn't define those terms in the original.
And at the end of the day, I don't think the prosecution quite proved enough that it's beyond a reasonable doubt necessarily. But that's also not necessarily the profile of our tribunal anyway. But for me, I did not really come around to Josh's way of thinking. I was not necessarily convinced, but I also had a little bit of prejudice when I watched the movie that I was bored out of my skull.
Yeah.
So I
there you
think
go, Joe.
America.
There you go, Joe. You got one vote.
No, yeah. I think that at the end of the day, there are a lot of movies that I do not enjoy that I think are good movies, and there are movies that I enjoy the heck out of and go, oh, it's not a good movie, but I like it. I'm not completely closed off to the notion that Star Trek the Motion Picture is actually a good film, but I'm not there yet. I would need to watch it more. And maybe I just, maybe it's more film knowledge that I need. But I agreed with, I thought you put it really nicely, that parallel between Star Trek the Motion Picture and The Godfather. I have no problem sitting, and listen, I do this with theater all the time. I have no problem sitting in one place and watching two people talk. I got no problem with it. This did not feel like that. It felt like this was something trying to break free, but never really managed to do it. So I will abide by my fellow judges' fellow. We were going by Commodore, right? Is that what
Commodore?
we were?
Yes, you're a fellow
Commodores,
Commodore.
yes.
I will abide by what the my fellow Commodore said, but I do have a little bit of a dissent to write in that opinion.
No, that's good, and I appreciate bringing up The Godfather, because who knew this episode would turn so much into The Godfather episode?
Yeah, that was just...
like
Well,
No,
there was,
I think it's a
I
fair
see The
parallel.
Godfather and everything when you talk about film, so I can't help it.
I think it's a fair parallel to draw. Listen, we've had comic books like this too, right, gents, where we read the comic and it's just a couple of people talking. It's a couple of characters talking around a table. And it can still be interesting, or it can be really boring, right? It just depends on how it's done. And in this case, I thought, in my opinion, I thought it was done poorly, but also, again, the time frame in which I'm looking at it, that might easily color how I look at that film.
I appreciate your candor as a judge. So,
No.
Chris, because of what happened in the last 100th episode with Joe, we just, your transporter accident. I feel like we have to just do a little due diligence, make sure you're good.
Oh no, that's no problem.
So I'm going to ask you like some questions, like we asked Joe last time. So, just for the record, what the audience would know, what is your favorite graphic novel of all time?
Oh man, I hope I'm not actually unintentionally changing, because I'm literally trying to remember.
We did a whole episode with Richie about it, and
yeah, it probably still to this day, it's probably Kingdom Come.
Yes, that is the correct answer. That checks. Okay. The other question is, favorite. Well, you have 5 of them. What is one of your top 5 favorite heroes?
Oh, Batman.
Batman. Okay. Yes. And so, Joe, I'm going to leave you to the sports, because that it's your desk. You share that desk with Chris.
So we still think that this may not be the...
Maybe we'll see. You could ask him.
Captain Kirk was separated into 2 with the transporter, right?
Possibly,
So I was just thinking off the cuff, Chris. I think Martin Brodeur is the most overrated goalie in the history of the NHL.
See, this is where I have to really disagree with you. I don't think the Montana Mountaineers can win 3 Stanley Cups without Marty Brodeur in net, right? So the Mountaineers before that, listen, they have a really, really storied history. Before they came to Montana, but they were in the dumps. There was a good chance that they were gonna have to leave and go to Saskatoon. And I'm glad Saskatoon got their own team. But I think you're out of your mind if you think Marty Brodeur is overrated.
I take it his response is not in line with the line of questioning, Joe.
Well, it's a little out there.
So audience, it's possible Chris is not all Chris. I mean, it's hard to tell. I wouldn't say maybe Mirror Universe Chris, but Mirror Universe Chris would not have the beard and goatee, but maybe he would. He would.
It might be stroke Chris. I don't know. I might have had a stroke during the transport.
Well, he could be a little bit thing. Well, anyway, audience, thank you for making it 200 episodes with us. And thank you for hanging in there for more than a year for the conclusion of this Star Trek, the motion picture 2-parter. Lord knows I didn't think it was going to happen sometimes. And so I'm going to assume that, this might not be our exact Chris, but it's close enough to say thank you for 200 episodes. Guys, thank you for 200 episodes.
You're quite welcome.
No, thank you both. It's been a
maybe we should put you back in the pattern buffer. We'll figure it all out.
Yeah, something's
it's been a joy. There have been some hiccups and some verps over here, but other than that, it's been a real joy to do these episodes with you gentlemen.
Yes, I think it's we really save our accomplishments for the anniversary episode, but I think 200 episodes is something to note, because
it's something to be proud of. Yes,
because Lord knows there's a lot of podcasts out there that I'm sure we've all listened to, have not made it this far, and we're still here, and we have an audience. It's not like this is like the only episode. We have many on the can as we ended this recording, so we're going way behind. So thank you both, gentlemen, and audience. If you stayed for the tag, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got the gag. If not, we have another 100 episodes to work on it. And
it starts now.
Yes, and we'll talk to you on the next episode.